My husband changed the locks while I was at the doctor. I came home to find my suitcases on the street. I just laughed out loud. Good luck, darling. He had no idea the house was actually in my name only. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that hindsight is 20/20, and Lord, were they right. I'm Marjorie Haywood. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in the same house on Clover Hill Road in Millbrook, Tennessee, for nearly my entire adult life. My parents built that house in 1961. My father poured the concrete of the front steps with his own hands. My mother planted the dogwood tree in the backyard that still blooms every April without fail, reliable as sunrise, reliable as grief. When they passed, Mama in 2004, Daddy 2 years later, they left the house to me. Not to me and my husband, to me, Marjorie Haywood, née Kellaway. That distinction, which once seemed like a mere legal formality, would become the most important fact of my life. I met Randy Haywood at a church picnic in 1981. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, effortlessly, almost carelessly, like a man who has never had to try very hard because the world has always smiled on him. He had a good laugh, a firm handshake, and a way of making you feel like the only person in the room. We married within a year. I won't say it was a mistake from the start, because it wasn't. We had 37 years that contained real things. A daughter named Caroline, Sunday dinners, a garden I was proud of, arguments about nothing that dissolved by morning. I don't believe in rewriting the past just because it ended badly. But marriages change, people change. Or perhaps they simply stop pretending. The first thing I noticed, and dismissed as women of my generation are trained to do, was the phone. Randy had always been the kind of man who left his cell phone on the kitchen counter, face up, unconcerned. Around the spring of 2022, the phone disappeared into his pocket, always. Even when he was just moving from the living room to the garage, I told myself he'd read an article about electromagnetic fields. I told myself a lot of things. Then came the late evenings. Randy had been retired for 6 years, and retirement had suited him. Early dinners, the news at 7, asleep by 10. But suddenly, he was meeting the guys from the lodge on Tuesday nights, coming home past 11 smelling of cologne I didn't recognize. Not alcohol. Cologne. There's something particularly insulting about a man who bothers to put on cologne for someone else. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I watched. By August, I had noticed that he'd begun taking an unusual interest in my filing cabinet. The one in the small office off the hallway where I kept the house documents, insurance papers, Mama and Daddy's estate records. I'd come home one afternoon to find the drawer slightly open and a folder turned the wrong way. Randy knew I kept everything in order. He'd teased me about it for decades. So why would he go through those files? I said nothing. I started photographing the contents of that cabinet every time I left the house. September came, and with it, a feeling I cannot fully describe. A low, cold certainty, like knowing a storm is coming, not because you've checked the forecast, but because your bones ache. I began paying attention to small things. A receipt for dinner for 2 at a restaurant I'd never been to. A charge on our joint account for a hotel 40 miles away. Nothing dramatic, nothing a lawyer could immediately use. Just a quiet, accumulating dread. And then came the day that changed everything. It was a Thursday in October. I had a routine appointment with my cardiologist. Just a checkup, nothing serious. I drove myself, as I always did. The appointment took longer than expected. Doctor, Okafor wanted to adjust my medication, and we talked for nearly an hour. By the time I pulled back onto Clover Hill Road, The afternoon light was already thinning. I saw the suitcases first. 3 of them, lined up on the front porch like soldiers. My suitcases. The set my daughter Caroline had given me for my 65th birthday. Navy blue with the little gold clasps. Beside them, 2 cardboard boxes stuffed with what appeared to be my clothes, my books, my bathroom things. The front door was closed. I sat in the car for a moment. Then I got out. I walked to the door and tried my key. It didn't turn. I stood there on the porch of the house my father had built, in front of the dogwood tree my mother had planted, and I understood exactly what had happened. Randy had changed the locks while I was at the doctor. He had packed my belongings. He had decided that this was over, and that he would be the one to decide the terms. The door opened. Randy stood in the frame, and behind him, barely visible in the hallway shadows, was a woman I recognized vaguely from town. Younger than me by at least 20 years. Her name, I would later learn, was Tammy Briggs. Randy crossed his arms and said, with a steadiness that told me he'd rehearsed this, "Marjorie, I think it's time we go our separate ways. I've packed your things. I'd like you to leave." I looked at him. I looked at the woman behind him. I looked at the suitcases my daughter had given me. And I laughed. Not a broken laugh, not a hysterical one. A clear, full laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and certain. "Good luck, sweetheart," I said. He didn't know. He truly did not know. That the house he was standing in, the house he was locking me out of, was not his. It had never been his. And what he'd done today in front of a witness would cost him everything. But that understanding would come to him slowly. I intended to make sure of that. I didn't sleep that night in the house on Clover Hill Road because I wasn't in it. I drove to Caroline's. My daughter lives 20 minutes away, in a small brick house she shares with her husband, Tom, and their 2 teenagers. She met me at the door in her bathrobe. I'd called from the car, and when she saw my face, she didn't ask questions. She just held the door open wide. That's the kind of woman I raised, and in that moment I was more grateful for it than I can say. I sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, and I told her everything. Not in a rush, not in tears, but methodically, the way I had always approached problems that mattered. Caroline listened without interrupting, which cost her something. I could see it in the way she pressed her lips together. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mom," she said carefully, "does Randy know whose name is on the deed?" "I don't know what he knows," I said, "but I know what the deed says." That was the first time I felt it. Not fear exactly, but a sharp, clarifying anger. The kind that doesn't make you reckless. The kind that makes you very, very careful. I lay in Caroline's guest room that night, and I did not cry. What I did instead was think. I ran through everything I knew. The facts, the timeline, the assets, the papers. Randy and I had a joint checking account and a joint savings account. The house was mine, recorded in my name alone, inherited from my parents. Randy's name had never been added to the deed, a fact he had apparently not investigated as thoroughly as he should have before locking me out of it. We had no prenuptial agreement. Tennessee was not a community property state, but it did recognize marital contribution to assets, a distinction I intended to understand completely before I did anything else. What had I lost? I tallied it like a ledger. I had lost access to my home. Temporarily, I had lost, or Randy had tried to take, my sense of security, my dignity, my daily life. I noted that. What did I still have? Quite a lot, as it turned out. I had the deed to the house. I had a daughter who believed me. I had 43 years of careful living that had taught me not to act before I understood the ground beneath my feet. and I had the photographs I'd taken of the filing cabinet contents, stored safely in the cloud, backed up twice, because my grandson had taught me how to do that the previous Christmas. In the morning, I borrowed Caroline's computer and I wrote a list. First, I needed an attorney, not a general practitioner, a family law attorney with experience in property disputes and marital asset division in Tennessee. I asked Caroline's neighbor, Linda, who had been through a divorce 5 years ago, for a recommendation. She gave me a name without hesitating: Ellen Marsh, downtown Millbrook, second floor above the insurance office. Second, I needed to understand the extent of the financial damage. Randy had access to our joint accounts. I needed to know immediately what he had or hadn't already moved. I called the bank from Caroline's kitchen, my account, my right, and learned that 2 days prior, Randy had transferred $8,000 from our joint savings into an account I didn't recognize. I wrote that number down. I wrote everything down. Third, I needed documentation of what had happened the previous afternoon. The locked door, the suitcases on the porch, the woman standing behind him in my hallway. I had taken 3 photographs from the car before I'd gotten out. I hadn't even realized I was doing it, pure instinct. And those photographs showed the suitcases, the porch, and the timestamp. I uploaded them alongside the cabinet photos. Fourth, I would not contact Randy directly. Not yet. Every instinct I had told me that the moment I picked up the phone and argued with him, I would give him information I didn't want him to have, about what I knew, what I planned, what I felt. Silence, I had learned over 68 years, is often the most powerful language available. The plan that emerged over those 48 hours at Caroline's was not complicated. Complexity, in my experience, is the enemy of execution. The plan was simple: establish my legal position, document everything, move swiftly, and let the law do what the law was designed to do. Randy had made a significant error. He had acted dramatically, emotionally, without consulting a lawyer, which told me he didn't fully understand his legal exposure. That was his disadvantage. I intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. Caroline offered to confront him herself. "No," I said. "Mom, he threw you out of your own house." "I know what he did, and confronting him before I'm ready would warn him. Right now, the best thing you can do is let me handle this the right way." She didn't like it, but she trusted me, and trust between a mother and daughter is its own kind of power. I called Ellen Marsh's office that same afternoon. The receptionist said the earliest appointment was in 4 days. I said I needed something sooner. I explained, briefly and factually, what had happened. There was a pause. "Can you come in tomorrow at 8:30? The receptionist said. I said yes. That evening, sitting in Caroline's guest room with my legal pad and my borrowed reading glasses, I felt the fear, really felt it, beneath all the planning, cold and real. I was 68 years old. I had lived in that house for decades. My mother's china was in that kitchen. My father's handwriting was on the wall of the pantry where he'd marked my height as a child. The idea that a man I had fed and washed and stood beside at funerals, had decided he could simply remove me from my own life like an outdated piece of furniture was not just legally wrong. It was the kind of wrong that doesn't leave you unchanged. I folded the fear up and put it somewhere it could be useful. Then I went back to my list. Ellen Marsh's office smelled of old wood and fresh coffee, which I found reassuring. Some environments tell you immediately whether you're in capable hands. Ellen herself was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses on a chain, and the unhurried manner of a woman who has seen everything and remains surprised by nothing. She shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and said, "Tell me what happened." I told her. All of it. I put my legal pad on her desk, the photographs on her desk, the bank notification on her desk. I had learned from years of dealing with contractors and insurance companies and school administrators that the person who comes in organized gets taken more seriously than the person who comes in upset. Upset is understandable. Organized is powerful. When I finished, Ellen was quiet for a moment. She looked at the deed, the copy I'd retrieved from my photographs of the filing cabinet. And then she looked at me. "Mrs. Haywood," she said, "your husband changed the locks on a house that is legally your sole property. He is currently occupying it without your permission, along with a third party you did not authorize to be there. In Tennessee, that constitutes unlawful detainer. We can file an emergency petition." I asked her to explain what that meant in plain terms. "It means," she said, "that a judge can order him out within days, not weeks, days. The fact that you've been married doesn't give him title to a property that was inherited solely by you and remains in your name." Tennessee Code, Section 66-6-101 is very clear. Your name is on that deed. His is not. He has no legal right to be there without your consent. And based on what you've described, he is there with the explicit intent of excluding you. That's actionable. I felt something shift in my chest. Not joy, exactly. Something quieter. Confirmation. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Ellen outlined the divorce proceedings, which I had already decided were inevitable, alongside the property recovery. She explained the $8,000 transfer, which could constitute dissipation of marital assets, a term that carried real legal weight. She told me what to document, what not to say, and what to expect. She was honest about the emotional cost, which I appreciated more than false comfort. When I left her office, I sat in my car in the small parking lot behind the building and looked at the ordinary street beyond. A hardware store, a dry cleaner, a woman pushing a stroller. And I thought, he did not expect this. He thought I would panic. He thought I would call him, crying, and beg to come home. He thought this was over. He had 48 years of knowing me, and he still did not know me at all. Ellen filed the emergency petition that afternoon. What I didn't anticipate, what I should have anticipated, was that Randy had apparently begun to sense something had shifted. Perhaps it was the silence. He'd expected calls and had received none. He'd expected tears and had received nothing. By Thursday, 3 days after the lockout, Carolyn told me he had driven past her house twice in one afternoon. She'd seen him slow down, look at the windows, and drive on. "He's nervous," Caroline said. "Good," I said. But Tammy Briggs, I would discover, was not a stupid woman. She was calculating in the way that people are calculating when they have something specific to gain. And she had been calculating for longer than I knew. That same Thursday, my friend Dolores, who has known me for 30 years and sees everything that happens in a 3-mile radius of Millbrook, called to tell me she'd seen Tammy at the county courthouse that morning, not in the clerk's office, standing outside the property records window. Tammy had been looking up the deed. I called Ellen immediately. "She knows," I said. "Good," Ellen said. "Let her look. The deed is public record. It doesn't change what it says." But it told me something crucial. They were no longer operating from assumption. They now knew, or Tammy knew and would tell Randy, that the house was mine, which meant the dynamic had shifted. They had made their move in ignorance, and now they were scrambling to understand what they'd walked into. The direct evidence I had been missing came not from a private investigator or a court document, but from something far more mundane, a forwarded email. Randy, in a lapse of judgment that I can only attribute to overconfidence, had sent a message to Tammy from our shared family email account, the one we'd used for years for household things, subscriptions, medical appointment reminders. He had forgotten, apparently, that I had set up that account and still had full access to it. The message, dated 6 weeks before he changed the locks, laid out a plan with a clarity that made me sit down heavily in Caroline's kitchen chair. He had written, and I am paraphrasing because the words are not mine to reproduce, that once I was out of the picture, Tammy could move in immediately, that he intended to claim the house as a marital asset in the divorce, that he had consulted someone, not a lawyer, it emerged, a friend with opinions, who told him that long-term marriage gave him rights to the property regardless of whose name was on it. He had written that he expected me to be too frightened and too old to fight properly. Too old. I read that phrase twice. Then I forwarded the email to Ellen Marsh. That, Ellen said when she called me back, is exactly what we needed. I hung up the phone and looked out Caroline's kitchen window at the ordinary afternoon. The neighbor's dog, the school bus turning the corner, the leaves coming off the oak tree in the yard. And I understood that we had reached a point from which there was no return. Not for me, and certainly not for Randy. The court date for the emergency petition was set for the following Tuesday. In the 5 days between filing and hearing, I kept myself occupied the way I have always kept myself occupied during difficult periods, with methodical action and very little self-pity. Ellen had advised me not to go to the house. I didn't need to be told twice. Clover Hill Road would wait. In the meantime, I worked with her to compile everything: the deed, the email, the bank records showing the $8,000 transfer, the photographs from the day of the lockout, and a written timeline. I prepared myself, dated and specific, covering 6 months of what I had observed. I am not a lawyer, but I know how to write clearly, and I know the value of dates and specifics. And Ellen told me the timeline was one of the most useful client documents she'd received in years. On Saturday, 4 days after the filing, my phone rang. Randy's name on the screen. I let it ring. He called twice more within the hour. Then, just before noon, a text arrived. "Marjorie, we need to talk. This is getting out of hand. Call me." I photographed the text and sent it to Ellen. I did not respond. By Sunday afternoon, the strategy changed. Randy and Tammy drove to Caroline's house. I saw them from the upstairs window. Randy's truck in the driveway, Randy getting out, Tammy staying in the passenger seat, visible, deliberate, like a statement. Caroline, to her enormous credit, went to the door before I could stop her. I came downstairs. Randy looked different than I expected. Not triumphant, as I'd imagined he might look when I first saw those suitcases. He looked tight around the jaw, controlled, but barely. "Marjorie," he said, "this lawyer business is unnecessary. You're making this ugly." "You changed the locks," I said. "I want a clean split, that's all. We sign some papers, we go our separate ways, no courts involved." "And the house?" I asked. Something passed over his face. He'd spoken to someone, a lawyer, finally, and the conversation had not gone the way he'd hoped. I could see it. "We can negotiate the house," he said carefully. "There's nothing to negotiate, Randy. The house is mine." That's when Tammy got out of the truck. She walked up the driveway with the measured confidence of someone who has prepared what she intends to say. She was dressed neatly, carefully, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sympathy. "Mrs. Haywood," she said, "I think if we all calm down—" "You're on my daughter's property," I said. "You weren't invited." Tammy's expression didn't change immediately, but something behind her eyes did. She looked at Randy. He was looking at the ground. Then her tone shifted. The sympathy dropped away like a coat she'd decided was too warm. You think a piece of paper is going to protect you? She said quietly. Randy's been in that marriage for decades. Courts don't ignore that. You'd better think carefully about what kind of fight you want. There it was. The threat they'd been building toward. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, I've already thought carefully. My attorney filed an emergency petition 4 days ago. The hearing is Tuesday. I'd suggest Randy speak to his lawyer before then. The silence that followed was the kind you can feel. Randy grabbed Tammy's arm, gently but firmly, and steered her back toward the truck. He turned once at the end of the driveway. You're making a mistake, he said. Randy, I said, you wrote an email about me 6 weeks ago. I have it. He got in the truck. They left. Caroline stood beside me on the porch, and we watched the truck disappear around the corner. My heart was beating hard. I won't pretend it wasn't. There's something viscerally unpleasant about being threatened on your daughter's porch by a woman your husband brought to replace you. I felt it. But I also felt the specific clarity that comes from having the truth in your corner. Tuesday's hearing was brief, as emergency hearings often are. Randy arrived with an attorney he'd clearly retained in a hurry, a general practitioner, competent, but unprepared for what Ellen had assembled. The judge, a careful woman in her 60s named the Honorable Patricia Rowe, reviewed the deed, the emergency petition, the photograph evidence, and the unlawful detainer filing. She asked Randy's attorney 2 questions. His attorney answered both inadequately. Judge Rowe ordered Randy and any occupants to vacate the property at 14 Clover Hill Road within 72 hours and return all keys to the plaintiff, that was me, forthwith. She also issued a temporary freeze on the joint financial accounts pending the divorce proceedings. Randy went pale. I didn't smile. I simply wrote down the order number in my legal pad and thanked Ellen quietly. That evening, I allowed myself something I had not allowed since the lockout. I did nothing. I sat in Caroline's backyard in the October dusk, in a lawn chair with a quilt over my knees, and I let the events of the past 2 weeks simply exist without requiring anything from me. Caroline brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me without speaking, which was exactly right. I was not unharmed. Let me be honest about that. What Randy had done, the betrayal of it, the contempt of it, the cold efficiency of having packed my things while I was at the cardiologist, had left marks that wouldn't heal quickly, but I had done what needed to be done. And in 3 days, I was going home. Randy vacated the house on the 3rd day. Not the 1st, not the 2nd, but precisely at the deadline, which told me he'd consulted his new lawyer thoroughly and understood that violating the court order would make everything significantly worse for him. He left quietly. No drama, no phone calls. Just gone. I drove to Clover Hill Road alone that Friday morning. I sat in the car for a moment before going in, the way you sometimes pause before entering a place you love after a long absence, wanting to hold the anticipation just a little longer. Then I took out the new key Ellen had arranged. The locksmith had come the day after the court order, accompanied by Caroline and Tom, and I unlocked the front door of my house. He had not damaged anything. That surprised me, I'll admit. The furniture was where it had always been. The kitchen was in order, if unfamiliar in the small way that a space becomes unfamiliar when someone else has been living in it. My mother's china was intact. My father's height markings were still on the pantry wall. What was missing were his things, his clothes, his tools, the fishing gear that had lived in the garage for 30 years. He had taken what was his and left what was mine. And there was something in that that felt less like dignity and more like retreat. I opened every window in the house, let the October air move through, I was home. The first attempt at what I can only call temptation came 4 days after my return. Randy sent a card. Not an email, not a text. A physical card. The kind from the drugstore, with a painted autumn scene on the front. Inside, in his handwriting, he had written that he was sorry for how things had happened, that he hadn't meant for it to go this far, that he hoped we could settle the divorce quietly and fairly without the courts involved. He mentioned, as if in passing, that the house might be something we could discuss privately, just the two of us, outside the legal process. I read the card twice. I recognized what it was. It wasn't remorse. It was strategy. His lawyer had told him that the email, the one in which he'd written that he expected me to be too frightened and too old to fight, was damaging, and that the wisest course was now to soften me, to suggest we could negotiate outside the courtroom where that email would be less powerful. He was trying to get me to the table before discovery could proceed. I gave the card to Ellen. "Hold on to it," she said. "It establishes that he's aware of potential liability." What Randy didn't understand, couldn't understand perhaps because he had spent decades watching me manage and accommodate and keep the peace, was that I had no interest in a quiet settlement that protected him. I had interest in a fair resolution, and fair and quiet are not always the same thing. Was I tempted? I want to be honest. There was a moment, holding that card with its painted autumn leaves, when I felt the pull of the life that had been 37 years of something that had contained real love, even if love had drained out of it by the end. The temptation wasn't to forgive him. It was simpler and more dangerous than that. It was the temptation to be done, to skip to the end, to take whatever he offered just to stop feeling the weight of it. I put the card in the folder with the email and the bank statements. That's where it belonged. The support I found in those weeks was something I hadn't expected, or hadn't expected to matter as much as it did. I had always been self-sufficient in a way that sometimes kept people at a careful distance, and I had taken a kind of quiet pride in that. But isolation, I discovered, is only manageable until the stakes become real. Once they became real, I needed people. And people, to my genuine surprise, were there. Dolores came every Tuesday with food and conversation, and the particular gift she has of talking about everything and nothing, filling the silence without demanding anything from it. My neighbor, Helen, who I had known for 23 years without knowing well, appeared at my door one Saturday morning with a casserole and the information that she had, herself, gone through something similar in 1997, and that she had come out the other side, and that I would too. Caroline called every morning at 8, just to check in. Sometimes we talked for an hour, sometimes for 3 minutes, but the call always came. And then there was the women's group at First Methodist, a group I had attended sporadically for years without fully belonging to. I went on a Wednesday evening, 6 days after returning to the house, and I told them what had happened. Not everything, not the legal details, but enough. The room was quiet when I finished. And then a woman named Ruth, who is 81 and has buried 2 husbands, reached across and put her hand over mine and said, "You did the right thing, and you'll keep doing the right thing. We'll be here." I went home that night feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Randy, I knew, was watching. Caroline reported that he'd called twice, not to her, but to Tom, trying to take the temperature of the situation through a side channel. Tammy had been seen again near the county courthouse. Their surveillance of me was clumsy and obvious, the kind of watching that people do when they're afraid, not when they're confident. Let them watch. I had nothing to hide and everything to prove. They came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after I'd returned to the house. I saw the truck from the kitchen window while I was making coffee, and I had exactly enough time to set my cup down before the doorbell rang. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, my kitchen, with my mother's copper pot on the stove and my father's marks on the pantry door. And I breathed. Then I went to the door. They were both on the porch. Randy was holding a small paper bag. From the bakery on Elm Street, I noticed, which had been our bakery for 30 years, where we had bought coffee cake after church on Sunday mornings for longer than I could remember. The choice of the bag was not accidental. Tammy stood slightly behind him, dressed carefully, hands folded. She had the look of someone who has prepared a role and is committed to performing it. "Morning, Marjorie," Randy said. He had his soft voice on, the one I remembered from arguments in earlier years when he wanted to de-escalate. "We just thought we'd come by. Talk, maybe. Nothing formal." I stepped out onto the porch rather than invite them in. My house, my terms. "All right," I said. Tammy spoke first, which surprised me. "Mrs. Haywood, I want to apologize for the way things happened. I didn't want it to go the way it did." She met my eyes when she said it, which I gave her partial credit for, while also noticing that she was apologizing for the method and not the fact. A careful apology, a lawyer's apology. "I appreciate that," I said, in a tone that indicated nothing. Randy set the bakery bag on the porch railing. "Marjorie," he said, and his voice shifted. Lower, older, something in it reaching back across 37 years. "We had something real. I know that. And I'm not asking to go back. I'm just asking if we can end this without destroying each other. You know what legal proceedings do to a family. Caroline is in the middle of this. The grandkids. There's no reason for it to go that far." There it was. The children, the grandchildren, the family. He was not wrong that court proceedings are hard on families. That was true. But he was using that truth as a tool, and I heard the difference. "Randy," I said, "what exactly are you proposing?" He had clearly prepared for this moment. He proposed, in organized terms that his lawyer had almost certainly helped him construct, a mediated settlement outside of court. He would relinquish any claim to the house in exchange for a more favorable division of the liquid marital assets, the joint accounts, a small investment account I'd built over 20 years of careful saving. He framed it as fairness. He framed it as mercy. What he was proposing, in plain terms, was that I trade away the financial security of my retirement in exchange for keeping a house that was already legally mine. I looked at him. I looked at Tammy. I thought of the email, too frightened and too old to fight properly. "I have an attorney," I said. "All proposals go through her." Something shifted in Tammy. She had been performing patience, but patience, for certain people, is finite. "Mrs. Haywood," she said, and the careful tone was mostly gone now. "You are 78 years old." 68, I said. She continued, without pausing. "And this process is going to be long and expensive and hard on your health. Is that really what you want? Because Randy is prepared to be reasonable. But if you insist on going through the courts, we will contest the inheritance claim. We'll argue marital contribution. We'll make the case that decades of marriage created equity in this property, and we will drag this out for as long as it takes." I listened to all of it. Then I said quietly, "Are you finished?" She blinked. "You drove to my house on a Saturday morning with a bakery bag and a speech," I said. "That tells me you're worried. If your legal position were strong, you wouldn't be here. You'd be in court." I picked up the bakery bag and held it out to Randy. "Thank you for coming by." Randy took the bag. His jaw was tight. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. "You're going to regret this," he said. "Possibly, I said, "but not for the reason you think." They left. I went inside and closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment. My hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular expenditure of holding yourself completely steady when everything in you wants to react. I sat down in the armchair in the living room, the one that had been my mother's. The fear was real. I want to be clear about that. Tammy's threat, the promise to contest, to drag it out, to fight every inch, was not empty. Court proceedings are expensive. They are exhausting. I was 68 years old, alone, with a heart condition that required monitoring, and she had known exactly where to aim when she mentioned my health. But the fear had an interesting quality. Instead of freezing me, it clarified me. It laid out exactly what was at stake in precise, unflinching terms. And once I could see the stakes, that clearly the path forward was not less certain. It was more. I called Ellen Monday morning and told her everything. She listened carefully. "They're bluffing about the inheritance claim," she said. "Tennessee courts have been very consistent on inherited property and sole ownership. Their case there is weak. But the marital contribution argument, that's where they'd put their energy. We need to be ready for it." "Then let's be ready for it," I said. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in December, 7 weeks after the lockout. December in Millbrook is gray and cold, the trees stripped bare, everything visible. I have always thought that winter is the most honest season. There is nowhere to hide. Walking into the Rutherford County Courthouse that morning, I thought that was appropriate. Ellen and I had prepared for 6 weeks. We had the deed, the email, the bank records, the photographs, the timeline, and 2 additional pieces of documentation that Ellen had obtained through discovery. Randy's bank statements for the 18 months prior to the lockout and his phone records from the same period. The bank statements revealed not 1, but 4 transfers to accounts linked to Tammy Briggs. Small enough individually not to alarm an inattentive spouse, large enough in aggregate to constitute, in Ellen's precise language, a pattern of intentional financial diversion from marital assets. The total across 18 months, $22,000. Randy's attorney, a more experienced man than the one he'd brought to the emergency hearing, someone named Walters, who wore good suits and had the careful manner of a professional who has learned to expect surprises, had presumably reviewed the same documents. He looked, when I saw him in the hallway outside the courtroom, like a man who had stayed up late. Tammy was not a party to the divorce proceedings, but she was present in the gallery as a witness for Randy's side, there to testify about their relationship and its timeline. I had expected that. What I had not known, but Ellen had learned through a deposition 2 weeks prior, was that Tammy had her own financial exposure. One of the 4 transfers had come from a home equity line of credit that Randy had quietly opened against a jointly owned storage property in both our names. He had not obtained my signature because he had forged it. That discovery, late in the preparation, had taken my breath away. I had sat in Ellen's office and simply looked at the paper for a long moment. 37 years, and somewhere in there, he had forged my signature on a legal document. Ellen had referred that specific matter to the district attorney's office. There were now 2 proceedings, not 1. Judge Rowe presided again, the same careful woman from the emergency hearing. Randy and Walters sat across the aisle. I sat with Ellen, my legal pad on my knee, my hands still. The hearing opened with the property issue. Walters argued the marital contribution doctrine competently. He was a skilled attorney, making the case that decades of shared life created an equitable interest in the property, regardless of whose name was on the deed. Ellen responded with the specific Tennessee precedents, the nature of the inheritance, the fact that Randy's name had been offered and declined at the time of the estate transfer. A detail confirmed by a surviving note from my parents' estate attorney, whom Ellen had tracked down and deposed. When Walters rested his argument, Judge Rowe asked Randy 2 questions directly. That was the first crack. "Mr. Haywood," she said, "were you aware, at the time of your marriage, that the property at 14 Clover Hill Road was held solely in your wife's name?" Randy hesitated. "I understood it was a family property." "Were you aware," the judge repeated with the patience of someone who has learned not to accept non-answers, "that your name was not on the deed?" "I assumed." "Thank you." The second crack came during the financial portion. Ellen presented the bank records. She presented the transfers to Tammy's accounts. She presented the equity line of credit, and then, measured and factual, informed the court that the district attorney's office had opened an inquiry into the signature on that document. The room was very quiet. Walters asked for a recess. Judge Rowe allowed 10 minutes. I sat in the hallway on a wooden bench and watched the winter light come through the tall windows. Ellen sat beside me, reviewing notes. From the direction of the small conference room at the end of the hall, I could hear raised voices. Randy's and Walters's, one controlled and one not. I did not try to make out the words. When we returned to the courtroom, Randy was different. The controlled, prepared demeanor of the morning had developed fractures. He was pale. He sat too still. The stillness of a man trying very hard not to show that something has gone badly wrong. Tammy, in the gallery, was white. She took the stand when called. Ellen's cross-examination was methodical and unhurried, the way a careful surgeon works, not the way a theatrical attorney works. Question by question, Tammy's account of the timeline of her relationship with Randy diverged from the phone records. Small inconsistencies, each one minor, each one documented. The account she had prepared and that their relationship had begun after Randy and I had already separated was dismantled date by date. At one point, Tammy looked directly at Randy from the stand. It was not a loving look. Randy, for his part, had stopped taking notes. His pen was on the table. He was looking at the surface of the table in front of him, and he had the expression of a man who has played a hand of cards and watched, card by card, as his hand turned out to be much weaker than he had believed. Was I glad? I'm not sure that's the right word. There is a kind of satisfaction in the truth being documented, official, on the record. Not a happy satisfaction, but a just one. The kind that feels like the world briefly working the way it is supposed to work. Judge Rowe took a 20-minute recess to review the morning's material. When she returned, she did not make me wait. Judge Rowe's ruling, when it came, was 23 pages. I know because Ellen sent me a copy that afternoon, and I read every page that evening at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my reading glasses. I will summarize what the court found. On the matter of the property at 14 Clover Hill Road, the court upheld sole ownership in Marjorie Ann Haywood, née Calloway, as established by the deed of inheritance. The marital contribution doctrine, the court found, was inapplicable given the nature of the inheritance, the absence of Randy's name from the deed at the time of transfer, which had been a knowing decision, documented by the estate attorney's records, and the fact that no joint financial contributions to the property's mortgage had been made, as the house had been inherited free and clear. Randy Haywood had no legal claim to the property. None. On the matter of the marital assets, the court noted the pattern of financial transfers. $22,000 diverted from joint accounts and a joint collateralized equity line to accounts associated with Tammy Briggs over an 18-month period. This constituted dissipation of marital assets. In compensating for this dissipation, the court awarded Marjorie Haywood a greater share of the liquid marital estate than would otherwise have been standard. The investment account, 20 years of careful saving, $31,000, was awarded to me in full. On the matter of the forged signature, the court noted that this matter had been referred to the district attorney and declined to adjudicate it separately, but the judge's written opinion included language I will not soon forget. She wrote that the court found evidence of a pattern of deliberate deception and financial manipulation by the respondent that significantly undermined the foundational trust of the marital relationship. That was in a legal document, on the record, permanently. Randy's attorney filed a notice of intent to appeal on 2 minor procedural grounds. Ellen reviewed it and told me, calmly, that the grounds were thin and that she expected the appeal to go nowhere. She was right. It was dismissed 4 months later without a hearing. When I walked out of that courthouse on a gray December afternoon, the cold hit me immediately. The particular cold of Tennessee in winter, dry and clean. I stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it in for a moment. The same steps I had driven past hundreds of times without ever having occasion to walk up. Caroline was waiting on the sidewalk below. She had taken the day off work to be there, though she hadn't been permitted in the courtroom. When she saw my face, she understood. She came up the steps and hugged me, and I let her. "It's done?" she said. "It's done," I said. We stood there together on the courthouse steps for a moment, my daughter and I. In the December cold, in the town I had lived in my whole life, in the state my parents had raised me in. The dogwood in my backyard would bloom again in April. My mother's china was in its cabinet. My father's handwriting was on the pantry wall. Randy, I learned later through channels I won't detail, had left the courthouse that afternoon a shaken man. Walters had been professional about informing him of what the ruling meant for the divorce, for the ongoing district attorney's matter regarding the forged signature, for the financial reality of his position going forward. Randy had left the marriage with his truck, his fishing gear, his personal belongings, and a share of the joint accounts diminished by the court's finding of dissipation. He had walked into a courthouse expecting to emerge with a house and a girlfriend, and a clean start. He walked out with none of it. I will not say I felt no satisfaction. I am human. But the dominant feeling, sitting in Ellen's office afterward for a brief debrief, was not triumph. It was something quieter, an exhale. The specific feeling of a thing having been settled correctly, of a wrong that had been named and documented and addressed according to the rules that exist for exactly that purpose. The world had worked the way it was supposed to work. "You were very well prepared," Ellen said. "I was organized," I said. "In this work," she said, "they're often the same thing." I went home to Clover Hill Road that evening. I made myself dinner. I sat in my mother's armchair. I looked out the window at the winter yard, at the bare dogwood against the gray sky. I was 68 years old, alone in a house I owned, in possession of my full legal rights and most of my retirement savings, with a daughter who loved me and a community that had shown up. It was enough. It was more than enough. Spring came to Millbrook the way it always does. The redbuds first, and then the dogwood. My mother's dogwood bloomed in April exactly as it always had, white and unhurried and absolute. I spent the winter reacquainting myself with my own life. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. I repainted the guest room a color called Quiet Fog, which I had wanted for 3 years and which Randy had found too gray. I joined a morning walking group that met at 6:30 at the park. 8 women between 55 and 78, including Ruth from First Methodist and Dolores, who walked slower than anyone but talked the most. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center, which I had thought about and not done for 15 years. I was not talented. I found, to my genuine surprise, that this did not matter. My finances, settled by the court, were stable. The house was mine outright. My cardiologist reported at my February checkup that my blood pressure had come down to normal. I thought the accurate explanation was that I had stopped living with a sustained, low-level threat I hadn't fully recognized for what it was. Caroline and Tom came for Easter. The grandchildren ran in the yard. I made the ham the way Mama used to, and we sat at my table with my mother's tablecloth, and I looked around at the people I had made, and something in me settled like a foundation being poured. Dolores kept me informed of Randy. He had moved in with a cousin in Gallatin, 30 miles away. The district attorney's inquiry into the forged signature had proceeded, and the uncertainty of it hung over him. I did not wish him prosecution specifically. I wished accuracy. The DA's office was being accurate. Tammy Briggs fared poorly in a way that owed nothing to me and everything to her own choices. The relationship with Randy had collapsed under the weight of what their shared future actually contained. A man with no house, diminished assets, and a pending legal matter. By summer, she had moved back to the county she'd come from. She was not mentioned around Millbrook anymore. What I felt when Dolores told me was something close to nothing. The absence of concern rather than the presence of satisfaction. They had made choices. The world had accounted for them. What I enjoyed, genuinely and daily, was the texture of my own life. The morning walk, the coffee after, the watercolor class, Helen from next door, a friendship that had finally, late in both our lives, become what it should have been years ago. The house on Clover Hill Road had always been mine. But that summer, for the first time, it felt entirely like home. Not the home I had shared with someone else, but mine. The place I had chosen, through difficulty and clarity, to return to and inhabit fully. My cardiologist was pleased with my numbers. My daughter called every morning. The dogwood would bloom again in April. People thought that at 68, I was finished. Randy thought I was too old and too frightened to fight. He was wrong on both counts. What I learned is this: know what is yours. Know it legally, know it completely, and document everything. Silence is not weakness. Preparation is not aggression. And the law, when you meet it properly, exists to protect exactly the people it was built for. What would you have done standing on that porch with your suitcases at your feet? I'd love to know. Leave your thoughts below. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for being here.